Welcome to the BrightWord Books Podcast. BrightWord is a leading platform for diverse storytelling, where voices from all backgrounds can share their unique narratives and connect with readers from around the world. Follow our regular podcast updates, where we strive to foster a literary community that celebrates creativity, inclusivity, and the transformative power of literature. And welcome to the BrightWord Books Podcast. I'm your host, John Lobb, and our guest today is Mr. Gary Lindberg, author of God's Existence, Truth or Fiction? The Answer Revealed. This is a fascinating book. It's, in fact, a scientific study about the proof of God's existence. The book's thesis is that science actually proves that God exists. Gary discovers why many Christians fear the concept of evolution, explains why they should not fear it, and how Christianity agrees with evolution. The book offers its own powerful theory and finally presents its unique conclusion. Sounds like a lot of food for thought there, Gary, and welcome to the podcast. We're so glad that you're here to talk to us today about the book.
Well, thank you, John. I appreciate you taking time to talk with me today. I'm looking forward to it. I'm excited.
Well, thank you so much. And I guess to start things off, Gary, we'll ask you what inspired you to write this book? Where did it come from in your mind?
Well, John, there were several factors that inspired me to write the book. First, as I was growing up, I started having thoughts that other people didn't seem to have. And one was that I started asking myself, well, who created the Bible? And as I thought about it, the answer seemed pretty clear that God created the Bible because he inspired people to write it and to organize it. Well, then I turned around and said to myself, well, who created science? Well, the answer to that was pretty obvious to me, that God created science because he created the universe and all that's in it. Well, then when I was about 12 or 13, maybe, well, I'm a little older, I guess now, I was a sophomore in high school, and it was time for me to take biology. So I asked other students who had taken it before I was planning on taking it, what was entailed, what was required. And one of the requirements they told me was, for a number of weeks, you needed to dissect frogs. Well, that really didn't inspire me or excite me, so I elected to take botany instead. Well, John, when I took botany, I learned a very important lesson. And that lesson was that all plant life is organized in 7 basic levels of categories, starting with kingdom, phylum, class, down to the most specific level of species. Well, I thought that was pretty interesting. Later in life, as I get closer to writing the book, actually, I started realizing that all animal life is also classified by the same 7 levels of categories: kingdom, phylum, class, down to the most specific level of species. Well, then it struck me, if all plant life and all animal life are that well organized, that cannot happen by accident. It cannot happen by random. The only other alternative that I can determine is that it must happen by design, which means there was a creator, an intelligent being or a God that created it all. Well, then later, as I'm growing up and getting older, people would say, well, there's no evidence that God existed. There's no proof of it. Well, I decided I was going to figure that out for myself. I was going to determine whether or not there was proof. Instead of writing a personal testimony that this is why I became a Christian, and that's how I know that there was a God. Instead of writing that, because there are other people who wrote personal testimonies, and they wrote it much better than I could. My story is simple. I was born in a church, as a Christian, and lived as a Christian. So that's as simple as my story. Then I was really trying to figure out, well, what is something that's neutral? What is a field of study can I find that would be neutral and be able to provide evidence about God's existence? And I determined that the only neutral source of study that I could find or figure out was science. So I decided to examine a number of different sciences. And so therefore I examined botany, I examined zoology, I examined human anatomy, astronomy, chemistry, physics, and even mathematics, because I took mathematics up to and including calculus. And then not only did I take calculus in college, I took it 20 years later and with business applications. And so I did it twice, actually. But anyway, the point was science was, to me, the most objective of any field of study that I could figure out. So I went through and read books, and I read books that said that God doesn't exist, and I read books that said that God does exist, and I've tried to gather the information. I even read Stephen Hawking's book, A Time Is Famous book. And so I put together different things. For example, one of the things I started with was botany, which I already cited to you, how that proved God's existence, and zoology. I really have learned that when I did examination of human anatomy, I looked at the brain, the eye, and the liver. And the brain, there are like 100 billion neurons and 1 quadrillion intricate synapses within the brain. How does that happen? Does that happen because random? It developed through evolution? No. Evolution, if you're going to have evolution, you have to understand that evolution deviates, or has to deviate if it's by random. It must deviate in every direction. There's no single direction that it can go. It goes everywhere, plus or minus, whatever your thinking is. And so the eye has 137 million light-sensitive cells, and the optic nerve transmits signals to your brain at approximately 300 miles per hour. Now, how does that happen? By accident? Wow. It doesn't happen by accident. Funny thing, I had a doctor's appointment just a couple hours ago, and the doctor told me that when he was studying to be a doctor, he had to dissect the human anatomy and look at it. And he said, there is no way that can happen by random or by accident. It has to be by design. That's the only way it could have been developed. And that was a doctor. And so I was reading that too. And so I'm trying to say that and why would we need a liver? But we have a liver to get rid of toxic materials in our body. Otherwise, why would it by accident develop? Why would it by random develop? There's no way. You have to understand that if something is positive, it could also turn negative if it's by random or accident. And so therefore, that's another piece of evidence. And I go through all the different sciences that I've already enumerated and point out these things. And all those are in the book. And I think that is fascinating. I'm suggesting that the evidence shows intent, it shows direction, it shows purpose. And that can't happen when you're doing it by random or by evolution. Evolution is not a subject that happened by accident. I have written another book. I more closely said that God actually does not contradict the Bible. And I guess we're going to talk about that a little bit, but it supports the Bible. But the most important thing is that the Bible and or evolution was a tool that God used to create. And that's where some of the issue and controversy comes in. But that's how I derived that I didn't prove that God existed. All I did was offer science as evidence. And I think that you have to acknowledge that there's a reason for it. And I closed my book that we're talking about with a comment about, well, God has a sense of humor. Well, what is his sense of humor? He reminds us every second of every day that he existed. Why? How? Because he gave us five senses. Those five senses, taste, smell, touch, hearing, vision, come from God. They don't happen by random. They don't happen by accident. And then, of course, in the second book, I realized after I wrote the first book that not only is there the five senses, we have our emotions, anger, fear, happiness. Where do those things come from? Do you think that evolution is going to develop those senses and those emotions? And we have to fool ourselves to think that. There's all that
Fascinating.
is absolute. I'm just saying this is what exists. This is what scientists say. This is not what I'm saying. I'm not saying that I prove God exists. I'm saying that science itself proves it. Because if you look at not only the sciences that I've investigated, you look at other sciences, I'm sure you're going to find the same thing. There's direction, there's intent, there's purpose. And that doesn't happen when you're just talking about evolution and just not being they're having no purpose or whatever. So that's kind of how I arrived at my thought.
Fascinating, Gary. And it's apparent you went about this as an investigator rather than a theologian.
Yes,
That is, you're not trying to say, look what I created, or believe me now. You're saying, look at what the evidence shows. You're investigating, you're discovering, rather than trying to persuade or convince people based on theology.
absolutely. That's right. Because, uh, I majored in history. And when I was a senior in college, I had to write a senior thesis. And my thesis was about uh, the socialists in Berkeley, California, and how they developed and so forth. And so I had to examine the evidence and then offer what I found.
Like a scientist, a true scientist.
Like a scientist would. And then when I was a graduate and I got my MBA degree, I had to investigate the subject about what companies do to motivate their employees. That was my thesis was that, well, let me step back a minute and say that as part of preparation for my thesis, I examined a lot of the work of Abraham Maslow and his hierarchy of needs theory. And then I examined Frederick Herzberg's theory, a motivation hygiene theory, where he claimed that the factors surrounding work were not motivating factors, including pay. He said the factors that were in the work itself are what motivate people to do better and work harder. And so then when I went out and I talked to more than a dozen different corporations, large and small, I always kept them anonymous in my thesis. But I did talk to Hewlett Packard, the head of human resources. So that's a pretty large company, even 50 years ago.
Absolutely.
And Varian, another very large company, and Ampex, that used to be a big name. And I talked to smaller companies. I talked to the president. I talked to people in HR or whatever, because I was trying to find out what they did to motivate their employees. And the answer that they told me was not what I was expecting, that they were following Frederick Herzberg's theory of motivation hygiene factors. The thing they did most to motivate people was to communicate. Simple as that, direct communication with their employees. And so all this is to say that you're right, that I approach this as an investigation, not as a preconceived presentation of what I believed. And this is why you should believe it too. I'm just reporting what the facts show, not what I'm trying to promote.
Interesting. Gary, do you think there are any particular discoveries that mankind has made, discovering a cure for a disease or putting human beings on the moon? Any scientific achievements that in particular correlate to the fact that science and the Bible are both pointing to the same thing as opposed to being in conflict?
I have not investigated that kind of thing in particular, John,
Hmm.
because my first step was to, one, find out, does God exist? And then the second step, which I did in my later book, God's Existence, Deeper Thoughts for Greater Insights, was to start to investigate the Bible and the books of Genesis and Exodus. And I recognized that some of the apparent contradictions that some people feel that exist in the Bible can be explained. They can be reconciled. You look at Genesis, it talks about how God created the earth and the universe. Genesis says God created the heavens and earth. That tells me that he created the heavens and later created the earth. Well, it also says that he did this on the first day, and this on the second day, and third day, fourth day, etc. For 6 days he created, and the seventh day he rested. So the thing I point out is that the Bible has to be interpreted correctly, and we are not interpreting it correctly. Because if we're going to say that God created all this in 6 days, we have to understand that God created it according to God's perspective of a day. We have to define it according to the perspective of God, not according to the perspective of humans. Humans think that God is a magician. No, God is no magician. He took billions of years to create. The universe was created in 13.7 billion years ago. The solar system was created 4.67 billion years ago. The earth was created 4.54 billion years ago. God's way of creating was a very methodical, step-by-step process, creating the universe first, creating the solar systems next, creating the planets in the various solar systems after that. And then following that, he created animals, plants, and humans, maybe in the reverse order, of course. But anyway, the point is that we have to realize that the terminology has to be translated. How many years ago did they first write the Old Testament? Many, many years ago. So what, 6,000, 8,000 years ago? I mean, I don't know precisely when, but we have to use the terminology and the definitions that they 1,000 years ago, not our current definitions. Our current definitions are been translated for how many times have they translated the Bible? We have
many.
more than a dozen in English versions of the Bible. And who knows which version is correct? Is one version correct more than another, or are they all mistaken? So therefore, you find that there are a lot of falsehoods, there are a lot of contradictions, there are a lot of embellishments, there are a lot of false errors in the Bible. And so we can't define it as infallible, as some Christians want to do. We have to realize that the purpose of the Bible is not to define all the history. The Old Testament is not a history book. It's a story book. The New Testament is similar. So, and if you have a car accident that happened in a particular intersection, you have one person at all four corners witness that. What do you think the four people are going to say about the accident? Every single one of them
four different opinions.
4 different opinions, exactly. So do you think that the writers of the Bible or the Gospels would not do the same kind of thing? Why not? First of all, the Bible...
They couldn't help themselves, right? If you're on 4 different corners, by definition, you're going to have 4 different perspectives of the same event.
Exactly.
And so it's not malicious, it's not intentional necessarily.
Exactly.
But your experience is different than mine, is different than the next person. It's just the way it is.
Exactly. That's my theory. It can't be any other way.
Mm-hmm.
And, we have the story about the fisherman who goes out and catches a fish. Then he goes home and tells his friends, neighbors, and relatives what a big fish he caught. And every time he tells the story, the fish gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Absolutely. And the same thing is happening. The same thing happens in the Bible. Noah's Ark is such a big ark. No, it's there were 600,000 people who left in the Exodus. No, there weren't that many people. They embellished those things. But we have to remember that the Bible, or the Old Testament to start with, was not written at the time when people knew how to write and knew how to publish. It was written, the first stories had to be communicated orally. And when they're communicated orally, it's like the fishermen. The stories get bigger and bigger. And
Absolutely.
so you have to realize, and if I may go back to Genesis, Genesis says that on the first day, it says, God says, let there be light. And there was light, and it was good. But then on verse 4, or day 4, I should say, the Genesis says, God created the sun and the stars. No. God created it in logical order. If he says, let there be light, in the first verse, there was light already. So he already created the sun and the light to start with.
Had to have done, yep.
So we have to realize that they made mistakes when they wrote it. But, another thing is that the Bible has 2 stories of creation. Did you know that?
I did not.
Well, chapter 1, verse 1 is a list of steps that God went through to create for his creation. But chapter 2, verse 4 is another version of creation. Now, the problem is it doesn't contain a whole lot of information about the creation. Its focus is primarily on an Adam and Eve and the 10 generations of Adam. From chapter 5 lists Adam down to all 5 generations that lived for 900 years, 800 years, down to Noah. Well, if they're all going to live 900 years, that's an embellishment in itself, because they lived a normal life, whatever it was. But the question is, how do you define a year? How did they define a year 6,000 years ago? Did they define a year at 365 days a year? Did they even know what a day was? Maybe, obviously, but the sun goes up and goes down. That's a clue. But nevertheless, for them, every year they would harvest wheat several times a year. So did they call that a year every time they had to harvest? Another way they counted time was during the 6th or 7th year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, or whoever the king was, or the 10th year of the king, or whatever. That's another way. So how did they actually count a year? That's another thing we have to define. So when we start to look at the terminology and the Bible, we find that they're not all that much different than what we are today.
Mm-hmm.
But we have to realize what is there. In history, I was taught by the historical method class that I had that you have to ask the questions: what, when, where, why, how, and you ask, why did they write what they wrote? Why did they say what they said in history? Why did they do what they did in history? And so that's the approach that I'm coming from, because I took a lot of science in school before I even got into history. And so I believe in the scientific method. I believe in science. So I have to look at it from a degree of science where I want very clear, absolute proof, not it probably is this, it probably is that. That's not science. It looks to me like it's this, or it looks to me like it's that. That's not science.
That's
Science
opinion.
that's opinion. And
yep.
You can't, and some of these critics of the Bible want to say that there's no evidence of it. Well, because you can't find evidence that Moses existed, doesn't mean that there's no evidence. It just means you haven't found it.
Yep. And Gary, is that what you would say to the atheist or the scientist who says, a sunflower is a beautiful thing, but just because it's all aligned with petals around the center of the stem doesn't mean that it was created. It just happened naturally. What do you say to someone with that stance?
Well, scientists are looking at it from their perspective, and they're trained in a certain way, and they're trained to question things in a different way than a historian may be wanting to do. And I think that if they are talking about a petal or a flower that has petals in an organized fashion, that makes me think that they're offering more evidence to my point of view. But it's really not full evidence. I can't I can't tell you that all scientific principles are contradicted or supported or opposed by biblical teachings, because I don't think the Bible which it's not a historical document. The way I have been taught is history. It's a group of stories. And the purpose of the Bible is not to provide history, although there's a lot of historical information in it. Absolutely. But because they want to offer contradictions is not reason enough to simply doubt it. They have
Discount
to
it.
prove it. If they want to say Moses didn't exist, they're absolutely right that their archaeologists have found no evidence that Moses ever existed. But what would have been the evidence that Moses had existed? It would have been obelisks, it would have been statues, it would have been physical things like that, or drawings or something like that. And they have not found anything like that. But does that mean that they searched the right century for that evidence? Does it mean they searched the right area for that evidence? Does it mean they did their job as an archaeologist should have done it? And that's where I challenge them. And if they want to say he doesn't exist, I have no problem with that. They can, but the evidence their conclusion they have to come to is that they have found no evidence of Moses' existence. Not that Moses did not exist. There's a difference between saying I found no evidence and then jumping to the conclusion that he did not exist because I found no evidence.
Absolutely. And Gary, I know in your younger life, you spent some time on the Ivory Coast. So you've been around the world, you've met different cultures, different peoples. Did that influence your thinking as you said about constructing the book?
No, no, that
Hmm.
really had no relation to it. It did affect my thinking when I wrote my second book, which was The Vegetable Grows and the Lion Roars, my Peace Corps service, it's a memoir of my service. That
Hmm.
very definitely was influenced by everything. And when I wrote the book, I have a bad memory and I don't remember things not that well. So, and I realized
Well,
that
we all do.
I realized that when I went to the Ivory Coast. So I started writing a daily diary.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so I wrote it pretty well for the first year and a half or so that I was in the Ivory Coast out of the 2.5 years I was there. So that was very accurate. But then in the last 6 months or so, I guess getting closer to time to leave, I guess I slacked off and didn't keep track of things as I really should have. But so unfortunately, I couldn't maybe provide some of that information that I would have liked to have done. But anyway, I did what I could, and that's the way it went. But I did have that resource available to me. But it did not affect my writing of the two books, God's Existence, Truth or Fiction, The Answer Revealed, or the other book.
Got it. Well, Gary, I know our time is running down, but I just want to say it's been a pleasure speaking with you, and what a fascinating topic indeed. And I assume you have new projects in the works. What will be next for Gary?
Well, now I'm trying to promote my books and not so much writing. I may have finished my writing career. I don't know. We'll see. But
Okay.
I want more people to understand that one, that God exists because science shows that God exists, and two, I wanted them to understand that the Bible is not um, infallible. It should not be read literally. It's a book that has flaws in it, but the whole purpose of the Bible is not to tell you history. It's not to tell you all these different things that people want to pretend it tells you. The whole purpose of the Bible, I think, is to teach us how to live a righteous life. The Ten Commandments is not telling you to do things that are wrong or correct. It's trying to teach you to do things in the right way. And the teachings that Jesus proposed was love God with all your heart, mind, and soul, and love your neighbor as yourself. That's behavior. That's not telling you to go kill somebody because they committed adultery or something like that. That's
Absolutely.
rather harsh, and I don't think that was the intent of it. There's a lot there that's still valid, There's a lot there that still should guide us. And I think that we need to be very careful what we translate and how we translate, because not only have we translated the Bible in erroneous ways, we have to keep in mind that the Bible was written many thousands of years ago, 2,000 for the New Testament and maybe 6,000 or whatever for the Old Testament. Well, when you translate, you have to understand that different languages are different. For example, we talk about how the Old Testament was written in in Hebrew, and the New Testament was written in Greek. Well, there are certain words that don't exist in English for Greek words, and vice versa. And there are certain words in Greek that don't exist in English. And I learned that lesson when I was in the Ivory Coast, because I learned that I had to speak French to teach the children how to grow vegetables in a more efficient, effective way in a tropical climate. And so I happened to be listening to the radio one day, and I heard this song that was very familiar to me. And the title of the song was La Toile de ma Maison, which translates to the roof of my house. Well, who writes a song titled The Roof of My House? But I realized that song was so familiar that the song was really Green, Green Grass at Home, sung by Tom Jones. That's why I knew. But if you're going to translate the Green, Green Grass at Home in French, you would say, in a word for word basis, you would say, Verte, verte, pousse de la maison. And it's so the two languages, French and English, even today aren't compatible. So how are they 6,000 years ago in Greek and Hebrew? So that's why when they translate the Bible, they get into trouble if they translate it word for word. They try to translate it meaning for meaning, but that's even dicey too, because you can get certain things wrong.
Absolutely.
I was reading a commentary online once that said the Christians misinterpreted the Ten Commandments, because the Christians want to say, thou shalt not kill. The Jewish person was saying, that's not what the Bible says. And that's not what the Ten Commandments says. It says, thou shalt not murder. A big difference, a major difference. So there's another way that language controls how we think, and we think erroneously when we want to say, oh, it's infallible. Oh, it got to be word for word translations. We can't do it any other way. That's unfortunately nonsense. And even God in the Bible says that man's knowledge is nonsense in the sight of God.
Fascinating. Seems like whether you're an atheist or a believer or somewhere in between, there's something for everyone in the book. So, Gary, thank you so much for being with us today. It's been a fascinating discussion.
Well, thank you. It's been enjoyable for me. I appreciate the time you've taken to talk with me.
Absolutely. We've been speaking today with Gary Lindberg, author of God's Existence, Truth or Fiction? The Answer Revealed. Thank you so much for being with us. And again, thank you, Gary, for being with us today.
Well, thank you again, John. I appreciate it very much.
You've been listening to the BrightWord Books Podcast, home of the literary community that celebrates creativity, inclusivity, and the transformative power of literature. Don't forget to subscribe so you'll never miss future episodes. Until next time, stay informed and stay engaged.